All right, wonderful. Everything looks proper and good. It looks like we have our participants joining in, and I know this is a topic that is hot. It's hot in the uveal melanoma community, especially right now, given just kind of the status of clinical trials. So for those of you joining us live here on the webinar, thank you for joining us. This is our second quarter webinar that we are discussing just clinical trials and navigating those. And I'm actually joined today with Shahnaz Singh and with Kelly Goddard, and they're from two respective doctors' clinics. They were recommended by two different uveal melanoma oncologists. Dr. Shahnaz Singh works with, is it nurse? You're a nurse. Yes, they're both nurses, I believe. And they work with she works with Dr. Carvajal is it Colombia now? Yes, he works in Colombia now. And then Kelly Goddard works with Meredith McKean in Tennessee Oncology, if I'm remembering correctly. So I'm going to introduce them in just a couple of minutes, and that should get us started. But let me just run through a couple of brief announcements, just in case you've missed things via email or social media. First up is keep an eye out this week for registration for the I Believe event. Remember, that's taking place in Seattle in person this year, as well as hybrid, so you can register for free. And as soon as we have the hotel link for registration, that will also become available. So keep an eye out, literally, for the registration for I Believe. Next up this weekend is eye patch days. So if you don't have an eye patch, feel free to find one at the store, grab one from our store on the website, just pay shipping and just start patching or preparing your family to patch with us on May 19th, 20th, and 21st. On any of those days. If you'd like to participate in the contest, be sure to decorate, have your kids get decorating, and make sure to submit those photos to contact@acureinsight.org, or you can tag us on social media in a public post. If you have any questions, please feel free to message me directly on social media, and I will be happy to just answer any questions there. But Eye Patch Days is a great way to get family and community involved, and just to wear an eye patch for the day, just to get people talking about ocular melanoma. Kind of like wear black for melanoma, it's wear an eye patch for ocular melanoma. This weekend, we also have the first two 5Ks of the year. These are taking place in Durham, North Carolina, as well as Washington, D.C. area. If you're not registered and you'd like to participate and get over to those areas, please register at lookingforacure.org, or you can reach out directly for another sign-up link. You can also register to walk with us virtually if you're unable to attend in person. Please make sure you're getting your teams involved, your communities, your family, your friends. And we do have a top teams contest at each of the events. So the team with the most participants registered will be eligible for a prize, as well as first place, second place, runners and walkers, all of that. So we're super excited for this weekend. This is going to kick off a really busy season for us. So stay tuned and get involved to be a part of this with us. All right, that's all I've got as far as announcements go. So Kelly and Shahnaz, thank you for joining us. Just pulling up your bios really fast. I guess I already said where you're from, but I'll just give a little bit more of a background for people if they would like. So just got to pull it up. Here we go. So Kelly Goddard is a new patient referral nurse coordinator at Sarah Cannon Research Institute. She's been an RN for 12 years, and she's spent 8 years in oncology and research. She holds a BA in sociology with a minor in criminal justice from the University of Tennessee. Her other nursing experience includes emergency and operation departments, and she is passionate about patient care and finding solutions to serve the patient. In her free time, she enjoys traveling with her husband. And Shahnaz Singh is an oncology nurse practitioner at Columbia University Irving Medical Center. She specializes in the treatment of rare cancers such as uveal melanoma and sarcoma. She began her career in 2011 as a research study assistant at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. And after 5 years as an RSA, she returned to school to complete a Bachelor and Master's of Science in Nursing at Columbia University. She joined the melanoma and sarcoma team at Columbia University Irving Medical Center in 2016, and she is passionate about helping patients navigate the healthcare system and increasing enrollment on clinical trials. So we're super excited to have you guys both here today. Like I said, this is a really hot topic in uveal melanoma. We have patients who have a lot of misconceptions around clinical trials, and patients who are kind of thrust into this world without a whole lot of guidance, whether it's because their oncologist just doesn't have the resources, or because they're brand new to this diagnosis and then they're also being thrust into the clinical trial world. So That said, Shahnaz, I know you had said you had some slides to kind of just walk us through some basics around clinical trials and selecting clinical trials. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you if you want to just kind of get us started there.
Yeah, sure. Let me see if I can share my screen. Oh, wait, I cannot.
Well, let me see if I can fix that. I should have fixed that earlier. Let's see, sharing screen options. Here we go. All right, try again. Wonderful. Okay, looks like it works.
Okay, cool. So as previously mentioned, my name is Shahnaz. I am a nurse practitioner at Columbia University. Dr. Carvajal is no longer with us. He's now at Northwell as of January this year, but we're still super close. I started with him in 2011 before my nursing career. And so I believe he was on this podcast before as well, just like sharing information. And so I'm going to share more of the clinical trials portion of it. I know he shared a lot about the disease and surveillance versus treatment for ocular melanoma. And so I do want to make this like an open format. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them as I'm sharing, but just some background on clinical trials. And so, you know, you get this new diagnosis and you're wondering, okay, what do I do? Do I do enucleation? Do I do plaque brachytherapy? Do I do a clinical trial? And so there's so many different options that are literally being thrusted at you. So just an overview on what studies are. And so it's research studies for new medical treatments to basically prove that they are effective and safe compared to what the standard is. All patients are required to fill out or sign rather an informed consent form to join a clinical trial. And this is basically background on what the treatment is, what the schedule of assessments are, what the side effects. It also includes cost. And so this is literally the most important form when it comes to joining on a clinical trial. I'm a research nurse practitioner, so I'm on the other side, and usually mostly primarily for patients that have metastatic ocular melanoma. And so I always recommend you take this form home and review it before you sign it. There is so much wealth of knowledge in this, and I never want anything to be a surprise. So I want patients to know what they're signing, what's involved, how much travel you have to do to the cancer center. And so I just wanted to like highlight that point because sometimes when you get like a 25-page document, you're like, do I actually have to read this? Yes, you do. It is super important and it's helpful for you as well as your family. And then there are different kinds of trials. So there's interventional studies where you're actually receiving a specific intervention, and that is to determine if it's safe, effective, and better than the standard of care. Or there's observational clinical trials, and that's really just to assess health outcomes in a group of participants. And so I stole this from you guys because I feel like it's so helpful to be able to give you just a clear screenshot of, okay, what are the different phases in study? So you may go to your oncologist and they'll say, okay, we have a phase 2 study that's available for you. What does that even mean? And so basically, a drug or a researcher will take an idea, work on it in a lab, and if it's shown effective, then they'll develop a protocol. And then from the protocol, they'll then present it to the FDA and the Institutional Review Board, the IRB, to see if we can actually test it in patients. So phase 1 is the very first phase of human clinical trials, and they're usually much smaller. For ocular melanoma, these trials are usually even very small because of just how rare the disease is. And so usually for phase 1 studies, it's saying, okay, is this even safe to give to people? Do we know the dose that patients should receive? And so usually with phase 1 studies, there are more research tests included in the studies because we're just finding out, how is this drug interacting with your body? How is your body interacting with the drug? And so there's a lot more what we call pharmacokinetic tests, PK tests, research blood tests that are involved in phase 1 studies. Phase 2 is, how effective is this treatment? So we know the dose, we know that it's safe, but okay, and how effective is it? So it usually opens up to more patients. And also we're discovering, as we're giving it to more patients, are there any new safety things and new safety concerns that are coming up? And then phase 3 is comparing that particular medication or that intervention to the standard of care. Of course, in uveal melanoma, that's a little bit harder because really right now for a metastatic setting, there is really only one standard of care option that's out there. And so it's comparing it to what's out there. Sometimes that could be a placebo. And so we can chat about that a little bit later. But basically phase 3 is a larger study, meaning with participants, because we're now, it's right around that registration time, meaning we're planning on presenting this data to the FDA. And so usually it opens up to more patients. And then phase 4 is after it's been approved by the FDA, and now you're offering it to the general population for uveal ocular melanoma. And it's, are there any new findings that have come up? Does it work for all patients in that demographic? And so generally on average, that process from lab to phase 3, usually for approval rather, usually is 9 years. However, if there is a phase 1 study that is promising, there is a way to expedite that. And I have seen that in many drugs, not just for ocular melanoma. And so the next question is, all right, so I know what a clinical trial is. I know what the phase is. How do I find one? How do I know if it's right for me? So the first thing I would emphasize is clinicaltrials.gov is hard to navigate. I will say that without a doubt. It's so hard to navigate, but it does provide some information that I find that is very, very helpful. Most cancer centers have their own website or their version of clinicaltrials.gov where you can put in your medical condition and a list of clinical trials will come up. With that said, there may not be a trial specific for you. However, it will point you to a navigator, a nurse navigator or research nurse. And we are literally your best friends when it comes to this because it may not be published on, I just included a screenshot here of the Recruit Me, which is our clinical trials database. And so this is available for anyone. It's just recruitme.com, and it will bring up all of our trials that we have for primary ocular melanoma as well as metastatic. And so this is the best database for us because even if you don't see anything, it'll link you to a nurse navigator and they will ask you all of your medical history. They'll ask you all the questions. And then that data then gets sent to a research nurse and an oncologist. And we will connect with you to schedule a visit for you to meet with one of our medical oncologists. And so this is super helpful. Like I said, clinicaltrials.gov is very hard to navigate. However, it does have helpful information such as inclusion and exclusion criteria. And I'll share a little bit about that in a minute.
Well, and something else to keep in mind too, just for those of you listening, the Acure Insight website actually has a clinical trial finder that is linked to it that is a little easier to navigate than clinicaltrials.gov. It pulls the information directly from clinicaltrials.gov, but it does really kind of narrow the focus and it kind of puts things right in front of you again. Just makes it a little easier to find and a little easier to sort through. I think the Recruit Me website sounds like a really good option, but like you were saying, like there's benefits to all of them and just kind of looking through all of them because I mean, I would imagine you never know what's going to fall through the cracks too in technology. Like something could be showing up on one and not on another. And we want to make sure we catch all of them.
Exactly. Perfectly said. Another resource is your medical oncologist. So connecting with a medical oncologist that is familiar with ocular melanoma. There are not many, but if you are in contact with one, they can let you know based upon recent data, meetings that they're constantly tending to, they can let you know what is out there. And so if you have had a visit with a medical oncologist that specializes in ocular melanoma, then they're literally the first people that can tell you, okay, I know what's right for you because I know your disease, I know your history, I know all of this information, and this is what I would recommend for you. And the last thing I would say is support groups, so such as this one. So this is a great way to be able to navigate, okay, what's out there and hearing it from other patients as well. So how do you know if a clinical trial is right for you? So every clinical trial has something that's called inclusion and exclusion criteria. So for me as a research nurse, if a nurse navigator recommends you for a clinical trial, I'm then looking at your history to say, okay, this is how large your primary tumor is. This is the treatment that you've had. And so I'm going through all of this and I'm combing through all of this information. This information is also available on clinicaltrials.gov, and it may be available on the site that you had just mentioned. And so this is basically like what we have to make sure that it's safe for us to give you this intervention. And so usually sometimes if it's something like blood work or a blood pressure or something, if you came into clinic and your blood pressure was 150/95 and the clinical trial says your blood pressure has to be less than 140/90, we're not going to immediately exclude you. There are things that we can do. We can send you, start you on antihypertensive. We can, check again at home. Like there are certain things. I say that all to say, even if things are not perfect immediately upon your screening visit, there are things that we can do to be able to help get you on the clinical trial, especially if it's a promising study and you seem like a good fit for it otherwise. Another way to know if clinical trials are right for you, is there a site near you? Is there a cancer center near your home? Maybe that it's not directly near your home. Maybe it's, I work in New York. Maybe you live in Connecticut or Boston and you're trying to figure out a trial, and if there's a site near you and it's only in New York, still I wouldn't rule that out, because there are options. Sometimes there are things that we can do locally near you at home. Doesn't necessarily require you to travel to the main center for all of your testing. And so I wouldn't necessarily rule out location immediately. I would just consider it. That, maybe there's something closer to you near home. If there's not, I wouldn't rule it out. What are some questions to ask your medical oncologist? And so I love, love, love when patients come to clinic and they have a list of questions already, because, when you get into the visit, it's so easy to get frazzled. There's so much information being thrown at you. You leave and you're like, wait, I actually didn't get to ask anything that I wanted to. I'm actually leaving here more confused. And so having a list of questions, especially when a clinical trial is presented to you, reading the informed consent and having questions ready. And so some of the questions: are there any patients at your center that are currently on this clinical trial? Is there any published data that you can share with me about this clinical trial? What are the side effects that you've experienced? So one of the things that you'll notice about an informed consent, it will literally list every possible side effect that has ever occurred with this particular treatment. Doesn't mean that it will happen to you, but it's just, they literally list everything from common to rare. And so in it, one of the questions I recommend is, okay, what have you personally seen in patients that you've treated on the study? And, how are these side effects managed? In addition to data and asking about side effects is, are there any stipends associated? So some trials do have stipends where it will pay you for a traveling cost. And it's usually within if you're traveling more than 150 miles to the cancer center, they'll usually give you a reimbursement for some travel. For hotel lodging, sometimes they'll give you a reimbursement for that. It depends upon the type of study, the sponsor, all of those sort of factors. But these are some questions to ask as well. What are the schedule of assessments? So in the informed consent, it'll tell you when you have to be here at the cancer center or wherever for your visits. Some early phase studies do require biopsies. And so that's something that you would want to know as well. So is there a biopsy that's required before I enroll in the study? Is there another biopsy required while I'm actually on the study? So these are things you want to know and deciding. Maybe you're like, I actually don't want to do another biopsy. Or maybe I cannot do another biopsy. And so these are things that you want to be able to know of before enrolling on a study, as well as side effects like I just mentioned. I don't know if you want to chat about this now, but I just basically included a list of studies that I'm familiar with that are out there right now for primary ocular melanoma in the adjuvant setting and metastatic setting.
So if it's okay, I guess I'm thinking, is this from here on, is this kind of the majority of the rest of what you have? Okay. So
Yes.
I'm thinking let's pause on the presentation for a minute and let's just kind of
Cool.
get some Q&A going. I know
Yeah.
I have some questions that we can run through that you didn't already
Totally.
cover, and
Yeah.
then we can bring Kelly in to answer some of these questions as well that she has familiar background with. So I'm trying to think So as a patient is facing, the possibility of a clinical trial, let's just maybe start at someone who's been diagnosed with their eye and their eye has been treated, they're undergoing surveillance, and they just want to have, I guess, kind of an arsenal of like what's available to me should I need it. Obviously, we would hope they would never need it. And we would hope that if they do need it, it's years in the making. But just because I know that as a patient myself, sometimes it helps to have that kind of action plan and know that should something change, there is a plan and that it is presently available to you. What are some of the ways that patients who don't currently have metastatic disease could look into, say, adjuvant trials, or as well as potential, like, this is what I would go for first, as far as just regular clinical trials are concerned. I don't know who wants to take that. Kelly, do you have any suggestions there?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I can say that in clinical trials, and they change often, and especially in your early phase trials, especially we have an adjuvant when it just comes out. The problem is there is the small capacity they would take in participants. So if someone needs that adjuvant trial right then, there might not be that availability. So we'd have to look at the time frame for them and give them those time frames so they could check back. I have a lot of patients who do that. They'll check back, hey, is this available yet? When you get in your later phase trials with they have more slots. Usually those are open, but as they get later and later, they start going into the phase of the FDA approval, and they might not be available by the time they need them. So there'll be newer trials that'll come in play. And so then we'll have to re-talk about those treatment plans again, about other trial options. So
So I guess what I'm hearing is that it's kind of an evolving thing,
right.
and that it's helpful to be in the loop with people who can link you up with those things. Like,
Right.
say, like in my case, I was a class 2 melanoma, like in my eye. And so because I was a class 2, there were certain adjuvant trials that were potentially available to me, but it took, digging, it took research, and it took obviously going through all of the steps that you just went through, like consent and learning what was the protocol going to look like, and how accessible to me was it going to be. But with doing that, there was a certain time frame, like some of those adjuvant trials, if they are going to accept you, they have like a time frame of, prior treatment to current, like
Right.
this is the window of time you have to even be included in the study. So I guess, just like you said, being in the know and just linking up with people who can help you kind of stay on track with checking in on those, that would be helpful as far as adjuvant trials are concerned. What difference is, I guess, just for definition purposes, what is the difference between just a normal clinical trial and an adjuvant clinical trial?
You can take that one if you want. I mean, either one of us can answer that. So adjuvant usually means that they're not metastatic yet. It's still local disease. They might have had like a surgery, or just immediately diagnosed. It's like maybe a stage 1, stage 2. They're not metastatic yet, like it's not somewhere else in the body, in the organ. So
and is an adjuvant trial, so obviously it's looking at trying to treat before metastatic disease, but the type of like medications or things that have used, like, is there a pattern of use, like that, a drug can only become an adjuvant trial drug if it's been through all of the phases in previous clinical trial, like with metastatic disease? Like, is there an order to things as far as, I don't know, like I know like VPA and Sutent has been used for an adjuvant clinical trial. Those are both FDA approved drugs. So like, is there a way to determine when and how something can become an adjuvant trial, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I can take it. So usually with adjuvant studies, the whole goal is to prevent spread or reoccurrence. And so with that, adjuvant studies are usually very hard to accrue, not really accrue to, but to open, because like you said, they have to be established in the metastatic setting. They have to prove that they're effective there, and then bringing them onto the adjuvant setting. And so we've had, I've worked on studies such as like crizotinib since like 2011. And so that wasn't a positive study. It was an adjuvant study, but basically it's very hard because you have to accrue a large number of participants, usually around 400 or so, and showing that it is effective to prevent reoccurrence within a certain time frame. And so usually the reason that there's not many adjuvant studies out there is just because cost-wise, they're very costly. to be able to start and accrue to, as well as they have to be able to show and prevent disease from reoccurring. And so right now, I don't know of many or any adjuvant studies that are out there.
Okay. So then I think that's basically the difference. I just wanted to make sure that we covered that. We did have a question come in from the Q&A, and I will make note of, checking in on this as well. But one of the questions was, is it possible to get a list of those questions that you recommended, kind of like as a, what do I ask my doctor prior to committing to the trial? I think visual, that would help. So I'll just make sure to follow up with you and get a list of that we can email out after this is, the webinar is finished. Let's see. So I think you talked a little about this, where is it? Do biopsies done? This kind of goes, there's like multiple questions in this, but do biopsies done, like the Castle testing, Impact Genetics, Caris Life Sciences, things that are done for the eye and or the liver, do those aid in determining that eligibility factor for trials?
For me, it does on many trials, especially because we're doing targeted mutation therapies. So if there's a certain mutation and we have that trial, they have to have that mutation and that molecular report in order to go in that trial.
Okay.
Or even if they need that fresh biopsy, they'll go and test it, called a central lab, which is the trial sponsor, who will test to make sure they have that mutation, or if they're positive, negative, to be potentially eligible for the trial.
Okay. And this may be kind of a weird question, but for someone who, say, had a spot of metastatic disease that's been treated, or multiple spots, and is now it wasn't treated with like a clinical trial, like just treated locally, maybe it was resected, or there was some liver directed therapy that was done for that kind of small localized area, are there ways to determine what trials that would exclude them from, like okay, so that's just a general question. Like there's going to be limitations even if you've had that kind of a treatment.
I'm sorry. I'm at
It's
home.
okay.
My dog just scared me even. She never does
You
that.
Jumped.
Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. It's like there's more people.
Yeah.
So just asking those questions, and like that's part of the prior history, I'm sure, like intake that somebody like you guys would go through a patient with and say, okay, like what's happened since your metastatic diagnosis? What's been done, what's not been done, things like that. Okay, so then are there any other kinds of prior testing that patients should have done, like really prior to exploring any clinical trials? Like, are there any standard of care treatments that can be determined through like blood tests, biopsies, like things like that, that we can narrow down the focus just so that we have a standard of care, if there is one available?
Yeah, I actually really quickly just want to speak to the prior point about metastatic disease and having it treated and then thinking about clinical trials after. So many trials for metastatic setting, they require you to have measurable disease or evaluable disease in order to follow you. And so usually it's at least 1 centimeter for a lesion, or 15 millimeters for a lymph node. And so basically that is how we are able to determine if the treatment is effective or not, because we have something to follow. And so if you've had metastatic disease that has been treated and you're considered NED, which is no evidence of disease, for many clinical trials in the metastatic setting, you may not qualify because there's something that you would need to follow.
Yeah, gotcha. So it doesn't count that they can just measure if something comes back. I guess it would, in my head, I'm like, oh, but like if nothing ever shows up, doesn't that mean the trial worked? Like if you had no evidence of disease and then you continue to have no evidence, but I understand the need for like that measurable disease to track something.
Yeah, and that's at baseline. That's like before
Right.
you start the study. That's like part of the inclusion criteria. When you're actually on the study, and if you have no evidence of disease, that is fantastic, because yes, that has shown that the treatment has worked, and we love things that we don't have to follow, to show that it's worked. But beforehand, you do need something as
that makes
baseline.
sense. Okay, so you talked briefly about like placebos. How do you know if you're going to receive a placebo or not, or have the possibility of getting like a placebo drug? Is there a certain phase? Like I think, was it phase 3 you said is that most likely happens?
Yes.
So then I guess there's the placebo, and then you said there's also the comparative standard of care where they're going to be giving you something that is used as standard of care for uveal melanoma. Are you given informed consent around that? Like how do they go about determining that?
Usually what they'll do on any consent, they'll show you it's a randomized trial.
Okay.
Usually what they'll do is the standard care, like placebo might get the, study drug, might not, and then randomized to the actual study drug. And usually they're called blinded, meaning that we don't know as caregivers giving you that drug whether you're getting the real drug or not. But the consents will have to state in it that it's randomized / placebo.
Okay.
So they have to let you know that.
So that's part of the consent, is that they will tell you this
Mhm.
is a randomized trial. And so if you don't want that possibility and you want the 100%, I'm going to get a drug, then you want to check off and say like, I'll save this
Right.
for later if you don't want that randomized possibility.
Correct. Yes.
Is there a time that a randomized trial can be more beneficial, like for a patient who maybe this is their first clinical trial? Like, I know there's some clinical trials that you have to have like zero prior clinical trials before you do this one. And so like, if it's in phase 3 and it's the only opportunity because it's your first time being able to do it, like, is that kind of weighing the risk, I guess the cost and the risks to that? Is there like a method you guys use for kind of helping a patient determine whether or not to move forward with something like that?
Yeah, I can take that.
Yeah.
So it depends. So for instance, in the KIMTRAC study, the registration trial, it was KIMTRAC versus investigator's choice. And that investigator's choice was different types of immunotherapy. Maybe chemotherapy was one of them, maybe not. But in that, usually with randomized studies, there is sometimes, not always, a 2-to-1, meaning like you are twice as likely to be randomized to the investigational. In that study was KIMTRAC versus the standard of care. So your odds of getting the actual investigational treatment are sometimes a little bit higher. It's not with all studies. And some studies are built in with crossover, meaning if you are randomized to the investigator's choice, if you're randomized to placebo or what have you, then the option to cross over to the investigational arm, then they allow that should you progress on the investigational one. And in it, like nothing is binding. So let's say you sign a consent form for a clinical trial. It's a randomized study. There is placebo involved. You're randomized. And if it's not a blinded study and they tell you, okay, you were randomized to the standard of care and you choose not to participate, that is always your choice. And even if you're randomized to the investigational and you choose not to participate, it is always your choice. It is completely your decision. And so no one can say, oh, you have to participate because this is how the trial works. It actually doesn't. It's completely your choice. And so I always share that with patients early on when they're consenting, especially for randomized studies and if it's placebo controlled.
Yeah, we always let them know that it's voluntary. You can step out
that was what I was
anytime.
gonna say. It's so important. And that was actually a question that just barely came in was, are you able to leave a clinical trial? And it's like, yes, you absolutely can. Whether you've signed the papers or not, like you get to have that prerogative to leave at any time for any reason. It doesn't, you don't even, you don't have to have a reason. Like you can just be like, I'm done. Like, I don't want to do this anymore.
Correct.
And I think that just recognizing that as a patient, that like we have the power to choose in this situation because it is a volunteer study is super, super important, because I think that patients sometimes can feel like, they've been maybe guided to this trial through their doctors and nurses, and they're like, well, I'm supposed to do this. I need to do something. But if for whatever reason, it's just not a good fit, there can be, I think, a level of maybe guilt or shame associated with backing out. How do you help patients navigate that? Like, do you guys have anything that you kind of, do you typically have like a list of things that you're going to move to next if you have someone back out of a trial?
Yes. Yeah, our oncologists I know always have what we call plan B. If things, especially if toxicities of the trials are not able to tolerate things like that, we look at other options and we weigh all those options out along with the trial at that time, saying if this doesn't work out, we at least have this treatment option for you. So we always do have those discussions about all the treatment options available along with the treatment trial if they decide to pursue the treatment trial. So that's how we do it here.
So what I was going to ask, I think I started to ask this earlier and then I got sidetracked, but I know like with Kimtrack, that's our first FDA approved uveal melanoma drug. We know that it is only effective in certain populations with like the HLA-O201 blood typing. So as far as prior testing goes, do you guys, as patients are investigating clinical trials, would you suggest that one of those questions that a patient go through with their oncologist is, do I have this blood test and has it been done? If it hasn't, then I need to do it before I'm presented with trials, because that is obviously like a good frontline option, in certain situations. Do you guys think that, I agree, I guess, that should be the standard of like pattern for investigating a trial, is that blood test should always be done to check that first?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I encourage it.
Yeah, same. And even like with gene expression profiling, HLA testing, all of those things are super helpful to have. Even, if God forbid it does metastasize, when you're in the primary stage, you already know, okay, I'm HLA-O201 positive. I know this already. I know any sort of mutations I have. And so all of that information is super helpful if, like I said, God forbid, it should metastasize.
Okay. I feel like that's good. Like, just again, like being armed with information, like is really, really important when you're learning and kind of choosing what you're going to do. This question from Amy says, how many different centers can you register with, or do you suggest registering with? So I think that this might also kind of play a role in just kind of trying to find trials and maybe potentially finding a nurse navigator. Like, is there a limit to how many centers you can get in touch with who are familiar with uveal melanoma? Okay, so I'm seeing Shahnaz is saying there's no limit. Like
there's no limit.
You could contact 20 of them if you wanted,
Right.
or 50, or however many you can find.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, you just have to do what's best for you in the terms of like, okay, what can I realistically do? What do I have time to do to handle? Because it is very time consuming to reaching out to all of these different centers. I would recommend doing one closest to you near home.
Stem off that, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And then one, if the place near you at home does not have a medical oncologist that specializes in ocular melanoma, then registering with a center that's also closest near you to home. And then 3, a major cancer center in the country. And so registering with them, and all of these centers, usually most of them have wait list. And so if there is a clinical trial and maybe it's not immediately available, or maybe you don't immediately qualify, still we have you in our database so that we can reach out to you, or vice versa, if it should become available.
So I have 2 questions, and so I'm gonna write down one of them because I don't want to forget. What is?
And I was going to stem off Shahnaz there too as well, with the multiple sites. All sites have different trial options. So I might not have the trial option and she might have the trial option. So that's another thing. If there's one particular one you're looking at, definitely, contact that center, because we're all have different, you usually have a slew of different trials, but we all do share trials as well. Someone else, another site might have this slot available where I might not. So definitely check those two as well when you're looking at other site options.
So you guys mentioned registering at a cancer center. What does registering entail? Like, as far as, how does that process look? Does that involve the patient has to travel to that center? Kind of, I guess, what does it look like to get put on the list?
I'll take that one for us. For our processes, yes, we will ask for records to be sent to us, and then we review those records. We call it like a pre-screening. We go through your records to make sure we call like red flags that possibly for the standard criteria that would exclude you from the trials, what your treatment history looks like, where you're at right now as far as your scans, looking at your, like I said, again, those gene mutations. So we go through that. Then we would like you to come for an initial consult with us. Yes, you would travel to see us, maybe to our closest site if those trials available there. But if you're a potential, we have you come an established patient, as we call it, so you'll be on our list for those trials that are come available.
Okay. That makes sense. And then to stay an established patient, like, do you guys keep patients informed of like I know some patients, for out of state, like I know like Thomas Jefferson, to stay an established patient, you have to travel like a minimum of 1 time a year to that place, even if you're not in a current trial or treatment.
Usually we're 6 months as established patient, but we do have an enrollment team after they come through our referral team who have them on their list, and then they are the ones who stay in contact with the patients after that, or they can contact back me as well. And then usually after that 6 months period, we'll just ask for updated records to see where they are at that time.
Okay, that makes sense. Shahnaz, do you guys have any other kind of differences or nuances to that process?
No, it's pretty much the same. We have a nurse navigator that handles all of our clinical trials. And so similar, they'll ask the patient to fill out a form so we can get records. And also, setting up a visit with one of our medical oncologists to be able to get the history, to discuss trials available. Should there be something immediately available that you need to then, that's usually like a faster process that we can do. But if it's not, we give you our, contact information, as well as, we have a list of things available for you, maybe in the future, and we reach out to patients if it's needed. But usually in that case, if you are just exploring studies and it's not something that you need immediately, and you do have a local medical oncologist, I always recommend, should you need it, like if you had a visit, for example, at Columbia, and you have a local oncologist in Colorado, reaching out to that cancer center, such as Columbia, for a clinical trial if you need it, because sometimes it's hard to, what your status is, if it's, constantly changing and evolving. And so I always recommend patients getting our contact information, the research nurse and nurse navigator, and reaching out to us directly if they need.
Okay, I feel like that makes sense. And that's just helpful, like just as far as what does that process look like? Because in my head, I'm like, okay, like, well, if I'm going to register at a trial center, like that just means I'm going to make a phone call and I'm going to ask to be put on a list. But it's a little more in depth than that, because you guys need kind of the baseline of information for the patient to be able to consider them on that list of trials. So you mentioned having a medical oncologist, and specifically having a medical oncologist, if possible, who's familiar with uveal melanoma, which is the specific disease that we deal with. What happens if you have a patient who has a medical oncologist who maybe they primarily treat skin cancer, they're not familiar with uveal or very specific types of melanoma, and they are dealing with, okay, their patient has metastatic disease, and the patient is being told and recommended no clinical trials, but they're being recommended a drug combo that's used in cutaneous melanoma or other cancers. How would you propose that a patient presented with that option, I guess, kind of call into question that practice? Because obviously they need a doctor and they need to find a doctor close by if at all possible. But what's maybe a helpful or tactful way to go about questioning that process, and why should that be questioned?
You can take that one if you want. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it's honestly a great question, and it's probably the norm, right? Because the number of oncologists that specialize in uveal melanoma is so limited and rare. And so because of that, it's almost like you have to be your best advocate. And so, if you are at a cancer center with a medical oncologist that specializes in melanoma, skin melanoma, but not uveal or other types of ocular melanoma, then, using, like I said, leveraging support groups such as this one. And so understanding that there are more options out there than just combo immunotherapy, for instance, right? And so learning and keeping up to date with what's out there, and then presenting that as an option to your oncologist, or scheduling. Sometimes some of our providers do telehealth visits depending upon the state that you live in, and if they're licensed in that state, sometimes we can do telehealth visits. So to prevent you traveling to a cancer center that's not in your state. But I would suggest having more than one opinion. And so a second opinion, a third opinion, especially for this type of disease, is so important, especially if you don't have an oncologist that specializes in it. And so, okay, if that's the treatment option and you need to start it pretty soon, which usually is the case, then saying, okay, I'm going to reach out to these different centers and get information about what's available, or I'm going to reach out to my support groups and see what they have, and then bring that information back to my medical oncologist.
Sorry, I was just checking a couple things, but I feel like that's really helpful, like, because that's one of the hardest things I think for us on the advocacy side is seeing patients who are kind of just through sheer unavailability of knowledge or just not knowing where to access the information. They're ending up in treatment centers for cutaneous melanoma and it's not working, or it's working very poorly, and they kind of are at risk of even potentially, not being able to do certain trials because of previous treatment history, things like that. And so just trying to make sure that that line of communication is open. And like you said, just emphasizing that second opinion is so important, especially if you're seeing someone who is not considered an expert in your area of disease. So just, I guess if you're listening and you are here, like, tell a friend, tell a friend, get a second opinion, consider telehealth, like look for uveal melanoma medical oncologists wherever possible. They're few, but there are a good number of them out there kind of scattered around the country. And so just finding one of those and getting in touch with them will really be very helpful. Like you mentioned, the big long list in the informed consent of side effects. So what role do side effects typically play in your experience? Do those side effects play in doing a trial to begin with and in continuing a trial? Like, are there certain levels of those side effects maybe that somebody would tell the person in the trial, like, okay, you can no longer do this, it's too dangerous for you. I guess kind of like, what are some of those signs or indications, like physically, that patients need to be aware of?
Do you want to take it, Kelly?
Yeah, you can take it. Yeah,
Okay.
You're good at explaining it probably better than I would be.
No, it's okay. So usually part of the inclusion exclusion is, sometimes certain medical history is excluded, such as in immunotherapy trials. If you have a history of certain autoimmune diseases, it wouldn't be safe for us to give you a clinical trial with a treatment that could potentially exacerbate that or make it worse. And so, part of the intake is, okay, what other medical history do you have outside of this disease? And, when you look at studies, most of them do have side effects. And so, asking yourself, is this even feasible for me to do? Can I realistically handle it? If the GI side effects, such as like nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, are very common and you work full time, chatting with your medical oncologist, chatting with your research nurse and team to say, okay, how is this managed? How have you seen this, with other patients that are on the study? Have they been able to live fruitful lives while being on the study? And so just being completely transparent with what you have on your plate, what your expectations are, and then being able to have a conversation about that. Most of these studies do have side effects, such as Kimtrack. The first couple of doses are administered in the hospital because of the side effects associated, but usually after that, it's pretty well tolerated. And so understanding that, also as you're on studies, maybe the beginning is a little bit harder to do. And, once you're over a certain hump, you get to a place where, your body gets more adjusted to it, you get more adjusted to the schedule, or just medications to help manage those side effects, you get to a better area. And so I usually say, depending upon what the side effect is, really trying to stick it out, and use the medications recommended to help manage certain side effects, and if it's feasible for you.
Okay, that makes sense. What does a patient do if there's no clinical trials that they qualify for currently because they're just not recruiting at the time? I know we mentioned kind of being on the list of centers. So like, is there a benefit to being on the wait list? And can you be on more than one wait list?
Yeah, absolutely. You can be on as many as you want. It's just whatever, comes available. And then you, like back what we talked about, talk with your local medical oncologist and ask them, discuss those trials and look at the benefits of them. Sometimes on the later trials, they have data out there that talks about how they respond, how they're effective. So, it's kind of your oncologist and you doing the research too, as well, asking those centers what they're seeing in their clinics as far as response, on the trials. Those things, those are the questions you need to ask when you're looking at it. So you could see what best benefits. And then two, we look at what treatments have you had already, would be your next line.
Okay. And then this is kind of, I guess, somewhat related, but if you have registered with a doctor and that doctor leaves their practice, they move to a different practice, do they keep that list, or does that stay with the institute, like say Columbia Medical Center or Sarah Cannon Research Institute?
They usually stay with the institute.
Okay. So if you wanted it to follow your doctor, you would need to then register at the center that your doctor has moved to.
Correct.
Let's see. So can some trials be administered at the patient's local hospital under the care of a local doctor? I'm going to guess that just kind of depends on the trial and depends on what is needed to administer locally versus in person. But Shahnaz, do you want to answer that one?
You go ahead.
Yeah. 9 times out of 10, the treatment cannot be administered locally. It's because they do not hold the IRB at that local institution. So with clinical trials, it's experimental treatment, right? And so it has to be administered by someone who's on what's called a 1572. So it's an investigator that has pretty much been trained. They're aware of how to manage the side effects. They're aware how to administer the treatment. And so because of that, it's usually tied to an institution and a particular investigator team.
Okay, great. Okay. I think that covers the majority of the questions. Shahnaz, do you want to move back over to your slides so we can kind of run through the available trials for uveal melanoma, or the current ones? And of course, as you guys live, if you have any other questions, like, please don't hesitate to reach out. And just so that we can clarify, primary OM, that means the tumor is only in your eye still.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So this is the single, and I'm familiar with this one with Aura Biosciences, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. And so this is a trial that, like, I'm going to share some studies, but this is solely, what I know of. This isn't a complete exhaustive list. And so, Kelly, if you have anything at Sarah Cannon that you wanted to add to this, please feel free. But this is a trial for primary. So you've just been diagnosed, you went to an ophthalmologist, a retina specialist, what have you, and they found a tumor in your eye. Before they do enucleation, before they do plaque brachytherapy or anything else, this is what the primary treatment would be, and it's light therapy. It's a clinical trial that we've had for a couple of years at Columbia. So this is adjuvant trials for ocular melanoma. So this is after you've had your primary treatment. So the treatments that I just mentioned, and adjuvant setting to prevent recurrence. Unfortunately, I don't think any of these studies are currently recruiting. This is what I know that I've personally worked on over the past several years. Sometimes, depending upon your case, if you're class 2 high risk, that's part of the gene profiling that's done with your primary treatment. If you're found to be class 2 high risk, Castle testing, then sometimes, not as much anymore, but your oncologist can work with your insurance to get a medication called Sutent approved. And it's a case-by-case basis. We don't recommend it for everyone, but if you fall into this certain category and you're the type of person that is not comfortable with surveillance observation, meaning just, doing scans at particular frequencies, and you feel like you want to do something, then that's a conversation to have with a medical oncologist, and potentially they could send or work with your insurance to get Sutent approved. And that's based upon a study that was done at Jefferson. Clinical trials for the metastatic setting. Again, this is not a complete list. This is just what I know that is currently available. And so I'm not going to list everything out. But these are trials and they have certain criteria. For instance, one of them, the IDEA study, is a frontline study, meaning like you cannot have had other previous treatments in the metastatic setting. And so the reason why, again, we emphasize why it's so important to get second and third opinions, especially with a medical oncologist that is familiar with this disease, is, if you went to a local oncologist and they're like, hey, I want to do combo immunotherapy, then that would rule out the chance that you could qualify for this IDEA study. And that is just an example. There are other studies here that allow second and third line treatments. But that is just an example. Some of these are liver-directed treatments, such as the Trisalis SD101 study. This is a liver-directed treatment, and it does have immunotherapy in combination with that. And so, working with, different cancer centers, your cancer center, clinicaltrials.gov, Recruit Me, other CureOM, to see what other options are out there. And like I said, there are some sites that have inclusion exclusion where you could briefly look at it and just scan it to see if you would even potentially qualify for it. What's involved in a clinical trial? So like I mentioned before, there's a consent form. And so this is, going over what the treatment is, how often you have to be there, side effects, cost, all of those sort of things. Usually we can do consent and a baseline visit in the same day. And then you have to do what's called screening procedures. And that is done to make sure it's safe for us to give you this treatment. And so regardless if this is for primary or metastatic, all interventional clinical trials have screening assessments. And so it's usually blood work, maybe eye exams, EKGs, echoes, scans, like it's a host of different things depending upon the trial. And then when you're actually on treatment, you have to come a certain time to do blood work. If it's a pill study, usually the pills are dispensed at that particular cancer center. Treatment is administered at that cancer center, imaging at different time points depending on the study, managing side effects when you're on and after. And then should you choose to withdraw consent, if the treatment is no longer working for you, if the side effects are not tolerable, then usually with clinical trials, we still follow you for a certain time period, just to make sure, we're in the loop if you develop any late side effects, and just to be able to check in with you. Overall, just to wrap this up, my recommendations are for you to connect with a medical oncologist that is up to date on current ocular melanoma clinical trials. I cannot overemphasize this. It is very, very important. Also, keeping a personal record. So, having your own record of, okay, when were you diagnosed? What was the size of your primary tumor at diagnosis? What is the treatment that you received? When was your last scan? What was, like, just having an idea of this sort of information. If you've received treatment in the metastatic setting, what treatments have you received? What was the response, the side effects to those treatments? Having that information and keeping a record in real time is so, so important, because you are your best advocate, right? So you're coming to these visits, especially if you're doing second and third opinions, all of this information is needed at that time. And then the last two we've talked about, so connecting with a nurse navigator or research nurse to inquire about specific studies, and leveraging support groups such as this one to find out information on new trials.
I feel like this has been definitely super helpful. Thank you both for being here. I do have just a couple other questions that have come in. One from the Q&A is, do clinical trials in the United States accept patients from, say, Canada or other countries in their clinical trials? And if so, like, what's the process look like for someone out of the country versus not?
I mean, I could take that one because I get that question a lot. We will take, other patients from other countries and Canada as well. However, the difficulties there is it comes to called a self-pay as far as standard of care portions of it, which would be the imaging, because we don't have that capacity here to be able to bill their insurance, out of the country insurance. So that's the things we run into there. Also, our oncologists like you, especially if you're going to be on a clinical trial, to be in the States at least for 2 or 3 months, just to check, make sure, not have any major side effects, and those can be managed. And then, so those are the kind of things we have to look at, but we do welcome.
Okay. Shahnaz, do you have anything to add there?
That's perfect. That's exactly what I was going to say.
As far as like just the financial goes, I know we've talked about stipends, we've talked about travel aid, that most clinical trials have that. I just know for a fact there are some trials that don't have that, or some, treatments that are considered trials that don't have financial aid for traveling. Do you guys know of or suggest to patients that they, link up with other resources that can help with the travel? And do you have a list of those that you would just, off the top of your head, you can think of? I know there's patient advocacy groups like Ocular Melanoma Foundation, A Cure Insight, Cure OM on some level, but are there other, like, just because I know we have a small cancer, but like, are there other cancer aid avenues that patients can go through for help in getting places?
Yeah, even at our site, we have called financial counselors who also help with those, we call financial help assistance when they need that. So they have also a slew of resources that could help them, guide them through that process.
Yeah. So the benefit of being with a center, like talking
Right.
to someone like yourself, linking up with the resources that you guys have at the center, super invaluable, because I think that patients, it does patients a disservice if they just think, oh, well, I just can't afford to do that, so I just can't
Right.
do anything.
No,
Just making sure they know there's options.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
Super
There's
important.
also Angel Flight Network. That's
Yes, that's new.
yeah, it's a company that I've worked with before that will fly cancer patients for free to treatments. And, I've had a patient on trial for years, and she comes from Florida to New York every month and has been able to use that. And so, like I said, I wouldn't rule out studies if they're not directly in your state or territory, because there are, companies like that may fly you for free. And that's not the only company. There is another company out there that has something similar. And we always team our patients up with social work to be able to, provide other options such as lodging. Like Hope Lodge is another one that we have in New York City that, will lodge patients for free if they're there in New York for treatment for an extended period of time.
Okay. Yeah. So there's options,
Nice,
and it's
yeah.
important to explore those options, not just write it off because you think there are no options. And then I think just maybe to end on, we've got all these different trials. Obviously they're going to be recruiting at different times, and you need to be working with someone who is in the know on what's available and when to you, should you need it. It can be helpful to, I'm just kind of summarizing, but it can be helpful to have like a running list of what you think you'd want to do, but just keep in mind that, if you don't go metastatic for 5 years, that list is going to change. And that list of studies, what's available to you, is going to change based on whatever's available in that present time. Not going to hurt to have that information and just kind of be armed with it, but just to know that it does evolve and change. Doesn't ever feel quickly enough for us as patients as far as getting somewhere, like with treatments that work, but it does happen rather rapidly. So that said, is there a level of compassionate use for different drugs? And at what stage in a clinical trial is compassionate use allowed? I guess, if that makes sense. And I guess if you want to define, one of you define what is compassionate use to begin with.
Yeah, I can take it. And so usually in later stage studies, compassionate use is allowed, and it's basically your own personal clinical trial where the company, the FDA, and the institution has allowed you to enroll on a study that shows promising results. And so in it, there's, on the back end, there's like a ton of paperwork in order to get it approved. But if it does work, it's great because it allows you to be able to receive access to a medication that you wouldn't otherwise, because either, the trial has met its target accrual, it's no longer available, it's maybe not available at your institution. And so, like I said, usually later phase studies, compassionate use could be an option for you.
Okay. So compassionate use later phase studies, would that be like phase 2 and on, or phase 3 and on?
It depends on the
depends.
study,
Okay.
and like the results, if they're very close to FDA approval.
Okay, that makes sense. And I guess I'm hearing too, like across the board with other pharmaceutical companies, that if a company is close to FDA approval, then that compassionate use becomes a lot more possible. Just because they already know it works. It's just a matter of getting all their ducks in a row to say, like, here's your stamp, here's your stamp of approval. I think I had one other question that I was thinking of when you were talking about out of country insurance. Is that something that is standard, like in doing a clinical trial in the States? Do the doctors administering that trial like have room to bill insurance, and how do patients ensure that they're getting, I guess, the most out of their benefits, if that makes sense?
I know for our doctors, like I said, we're not able to bill for the insurance just because of different regulations. I can't get it out. Regulations. I didn't want to say regulatory regulations. So that's the problem there. As far as the benefit, if we mark them as, we call it, quote unquote, self-pay, we go back to those financial assistance, those programs that help them. So they're making sure they're getting what are needed. We also try to look at trials too, to make sure they're not getting any of the standard care. They're actually getting the drug that's getting paid for through the pharmaceutical company. So
Okay.
they're not we try to, keep the cost down as much as possible.
That makes sense. Makes sense. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any other questions from our Q&A, and I feel like this has been a pretty good kind of clinical trials 101 discussion. Thank you both for your time, and for anyone who's listening to the recording, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, and I am happy to forward those on to either of these wonderful ladies. And then Shahnaz, you mentioned the doctor questions, like just that kind of basic list of questions. She's going to send that over to me. And I guess if you don't mind sending me your slides as well, then I will include a few screenshots from those slides, and we'll make sure to send a follow-up email after this webinar is all completed and uploaded, just so that everyone can access some of that information.
Yeah, that sounds good. This is super important, and
Yes.
I completely admire you for doing this. It's so important to get this information out so that patients, have a central place where they can go to get this. And so thank you for this time.
Yeah, thank you
agree.
both again for your time today. We will essentially have you back another time, but I'll keep you in the loop if I get any questions from our audience, and I'll let you guys get back to your day. Thanks everybody for joining.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.